And those would be to say first and foremost that Your Grace, we thank You for the leadership in inviting to the panel this year 2 women, because this is the first time we've had women panelists at the conversations in the Cathedral. And I'm sure that it's the magic of the women that has filled the Cathedral tonight. So let's hear it also for all the women's groups who have come in their great numbers. And I think that that means also that the theme is that relevant. So Your Grace, thank You for this leadership. Secondly, Your Grace, I think that we would like to thank You again because this theme is standing on 2 feet. The first foot is that of motherhood or of womanhood, and the second is that of childhood. And You, Your Grace, have put your first foot forward through your Legacy of Hope project to seek to build a children's hospital for Accra. So in those 2 respects, you show great leadership, and we want to say with you that may God, who has begun this good work in you, bring it to completion. And now I will turn my attention to the topic that we have. I would like to make 3 points. I hope that Ben will permit me to do just that. I will be making 3 points. My first observation will be about motherhood. The second, I will reflect or say a word about swaddling clothes. And thirdly, I will speak about the child or childhood. So those will be the 3 points I'd like to reflect on. So let's begin with the first one. The first one is about motherhood. Now, my interest begins with what the concept of motherhood is in the Bible at all. And to be able to do this, would have to go into the book of Exodus, chapter 34, the account in which Moses encounters the Lord on Mount Sinai. This is reading from verse 7. And God reveals himself, reveals his own nature to Moses. Now, of course, remember that at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it says that Moses is the only one who spoke to God panim b'panim, face to face. So, indeed, in the entire Old Testament, there is no one who has that intimate knowledge of God. And it's quite interesting because it reads here, it says, from verse 6, the Lord then passed in front of him and cried out, the Lord, Adonai, Adonai, a God full of tender love and graciousness, slow to anger and abounding in fidelity and kindness. Now, what is interesting to me is the first word, the very first word by which God self-identifies. He says, the God of tender love. In fact, the Hebrew word is rechem. And that word rechem, from which you hear our Muslim brothers say rahmatullah and so on and so forth, rechem actually refers to the womb. So in Hebrew, it would actually mean compassion, but it actually, in Hebrew, if you said rechem, you're talking about a mother's womb. That's what it is. And it's interesting that in such a patriarchal society as Israel, when God is self-identifying to Moses, he says, my name is Rechem. My name is womb. As a student of the Bible, when I try to translate this into English and it says compassion, I feel that there is something lost in translation. I think we should lend the Akan word abade to the English speakers so that they will have a new word in their vocabulary. Because compassion doesn't even do it sufficiently. Abade is the fact that even though men run faster than women, when the baby falls, the woman gets there first. That's abade. And God self-identifies as Rechem. So my contention is that if you haven't understood motherhood, you haven't even understood who God is at all. We need to begin to understand God from the concept of motherhood, because when he's revealing himself to Moses, that's the first word he uses. I am first and foremost the womb, motherhood, creation, whatever you want to call it. So that's my first point. Now the second point is to reflect on swaddling. So swaddling clothes. So we're reading from Luke chapter 2 verse 10. And over there, we're reading these words, swaddling clothes. And I'm sure that we've been singing these in Christmas carols several times. And sometimes we're left wondering what exactly swaddling clothes are. In actual fact, the first time swaddling clothes are mentioned in Scripture is in the book of Ezekiel chapter 16 and reading from verse 4. But I will go through that passage briefly for our benefit. Now this is what it says. Again, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, make known to Jerusalem her abominations and say, thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth are of the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. And as for your birth, on the day you were born, this is verse 4, on the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to cleanse you, nor rubbed with salt, nor wrapped in swaddling clothes. It's actually the first time we encounter the language of swaddling clothes in the Bible is in Ezekiel chapter 16 verse 4. And it is in reference to Israel. And Israel, look, when you were born, you were not even wrapped. You were not wrapped in swaddling clothes. You had nothing. You had nothing. Now, when therefore we begin to read in Luke chapter 2 and reading from verse 7, and it says, she wrapped him in swaddling clothes. First and foremost, of course, at the first level, we are talking about Jesus being wrapped in swaddling clothes. But Jesus is representing the entire Israel. He's representing each one of us. And there is a huge transformation taking place in Israel. For the first time, Israel is being wrapped with swaddling clothes, with the care and the love of God. And what instrument did God use to achieve that? Mary. Mary. So that makes us really understand, in fact, the role of Mother Mary for all of us Christians. She was the one who was used to change the story of Israel, to wrap him in a garment, for the first time, to show Israel a certain love of God, the tenderness of God, the compassion of God. Mary was going to be that instrument to show that God was that close to humanity. And I think that is what I take away from the question of swaddling clothes when we read that in Luke's Gospel, chapter 7. Now, if we continue from there, then we have to finally end with the third point, which I say is the child. And for those of us who are students of the Bible, we know that if you're reading the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 1 and chapter 2 are one unit, which we call, the infancy narratives. So what is happening is that the story of the childhood of Jesus is not finished in chapter 2 verse 7, which we read. No, it's going to continue until the end of chapter 2 verse 52. In fact, when, as Auntie Joy said, when Jesus got lost in the temple and Mary came and was looking for the child and eventually found Jesus, she addressed him as teknon, child. He's still a child. 12 years old, maybe 13, but he's still a child. And this strikes me deeply because I don't want to tell you my age, but anytime I go home, my mother still considers me a child. I remember that when I got back from studies in Rome, I stayed at home with my parents for about 3 months. I was well over 40 years by then. And from time to time, I'd have an evening program at the Cathedral or one other parish. I'd go and come back at 10 p.m. and my mom will be sitting down waiting for me. And I say, Amma, I was 8 years in Rome and I was able to take good care of myself. Why are you sitting here? She says, for as long as I'm alive, you are my child. So motherhood is not jettisoned, it's not set aside. We will continue to be children. And Mary understood that this was her child, and she was going to follow him, she was going to be with him all through, and that is why she is there right to the foot of the cross. That's clear. But there are three things in Luke chapter 2 that I think underline what Mary does to ensure that this child is going to grow up and grow up well. And I think that these are the things that I want our mothers to carry away. The first one, if you read from Luke chapter 2, reading from verse 41 and following, you'd realize that it says that Mary and Joseph took the child Jesus at the time of the Passover to the temple. That's number one. The second thing we hear is that when he was there, he was with the scribes and the elders. He was listening to them and he was asking them questions. The second thing we hear. The third thing we hear is that he went back to Nazareth and he was submissive to them. Three things. And I'd like our mothers, and indeed all of us, to reflect on these 3 points. The first one, Mary and Joseph would take the child to the temple. That is religious education, religious upbringing. I came from the kind of a family where you dared not go, run away or not go to church on Sunday. It was completely out of the question. Religious education. We need to continue religiously educating our children. These days, we are sad to say sometimes even the catechism, it's not going that well. We need to talk about what is happening at Sunday school. Sunday school is on autopilot. So we need to go back to those concepts. We need to ask ourselves what we are doing, especially in this wild religious environment that we have in Ghana. How do we protect the faith of our young ones? How do we protect their faith? As the first concern of Mary and Joseph was to hold the hand of the child and take that child to the Passover. That's number one. Number two, it says that he was there with the elders, listening to them and asking them questions. Now we know that in antiquity, the temple or the synagogue was the school. There were no formal schools. Education happened in the synagogue. Paul would be in the synagogue in Tarsus, later on in Gamaliel's synagogue in Jerusalem. That is where he will have his training. The second thing is, what are we doing with the intellectual formation of our young ones? Mothers, what is happening when you are looking for a school for your children after BC? How are we doing that? The churches, we have the schools. What is happening in our schools? These are questions that we can ask on the ecumenical level, because sadly the Catholic Church alone doesn't have the answers. We have to talk about it ecumenically and find a solution to the intellectual development of our children in faith-based schools. Finally, it says that Jesus came back home and was submissive to them in the home. You can have all the PhDs in the world, but if your mother didn't train you well, it's a disaster. And that is why we want to emphasize the upbringing of children in the home. And who are the best protagonists to do this? Our mothers. The children and their future is in your hands. If we are sitting up here, most probably it is because we had mothers at home. And if there will be good leaders of our country tomorrow, those leaders are in your homes, our mothers.